So firstly, I'd like to thank all of you for taking time to join on this webinar. We'd like to spend the next 50 odd minutes sharing a few insights on understanding Microsoft Azure, how to plan, deploy, and manage operations in Azure. So as with most webinars, this webinar will also be recorded and emailed to all you attendees. You are free to post questions by clicking on the question box in the control panel, and we'll make a sincere attempt to address all your queries towards the end of this webinar. Please note that all attendees are in mute throughout the webinar. And I would encourage you to send us your feedback on the email address provided below. All right, before we dive deeper into today's topic, I'd like to give a short summary about Trigent software. We are a mid-level Microsoft Gold certified software development company based out of Boston with a strong development backbone in Bangalore, India. We have successfully operated for over 20 years with global revenues of over $30 million. We have built technology centers of excellence in SharePoint, Office 365, Yammer, Windows Azure, and mobile. And our journey with Microsoft dates back to early 2000, and over the last decade we have executed over 100 successful SharePoint enterprise deployments with an in-house competency of 100 plus Microsoft certified consultants. We at Trigent offer an array of services from quick start and planning, that's involving assessment and advisory based consulting, to design and architecturing a SharePoint farm. Also end-to-end implementation, migration services, and deployment services on both on-premises as well as on the cloud. Today, we support and maintain several large SharePoint installations for many of our customers. All right, here's a representative list of our customers. Now the list includes Fortune 100 companies to mid-sized firms and even startups across business verticals, which include independent software vendors and enterprises in banking and finance, insurance and mortgage, credit lending, e-retail, manufacturing, supply chain management, media and advisory, schools and colleges, e-learning, and so on and so forth. All right, that's me on the left. I am Lawrence. I'm the manager of business development with Microsoft practice here at Trigent. And I come with about a decade of experience in technology consulting. And towards the right is my colleague Trigent. Trigent, could you please introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. Myself, Trigent, works as a tech lead in Trigent. I have more than a decade of experience in working with the different Microsoft technologies, which is spread across into design, development, implementation front. I have closely worked on web development, SharePoint implementations, and Azure configurations. I also hands-on into some of the BI tool, which is coming from Microsoft. In fact, that's the Power BI.
All right. Thank you so much, Trigent. Now let's move ahead with the agenda, and that's to do with the main topic for today. Over to you, Trigent.
Okay, so let us start for the today's session, that is hosting SharePoint farm in Azure. So is your SharePoint already in cloud yet? So we know like all the applications or all the environment, all enterprises is moving into cloud. We everywhere hear about the enterprise applications or all the applications more. The cloud is which is something very much popular and which is more reliable. We could identify it. So well, not a problem. If your SharePoint is not into cloud, not a problem. There are different approaches to move into cloud. Probably one of the approach which we are familiar is the SharePoint Online, which is part of Office 365. What is the other alternate? That's what we are going to explore in today's session, hosting SharePoint in Azure. So we check how does it work, how do we implement, how do we deploy, and what are the advantages and what are the subscriptions. And before that, we'll understand what is Microsoft Azure about. So during this webinar, we will discuss on hosting your SharePoint farm in Azure, a highly scalable solution based on demand. You can add or remove resources rapidly, thereby saving infrastructure costs. As I said, today's agenda include understand Microsoft Azure, which is an IaaS service, storage, subscription, and licensing options. We will packed with a demo of what is the Azure Management Portal and what are the different farm templates available from Azure Portal, which is required for SharePoint. All right, let us start by understand a bit about Microsoft Azure. Microsoft Azure is a cloud computing service which is created by Microsoft for building, deploying, and managing applications and services through a global network of Microsoft managed data centers. Azure provides software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service, and supports many different programming languages or tools and frameworks, including Microsoft specific or even third-party software systems. So what is an IaaS? Infrastructure as a service is an instant computing infrastructure provisioned and managed over internet, which can quickly scale up and down the services or the servers with demand and pay only for what we are using it for. In an IaaS model, a third-party provider hosts the hardware, software, servers, storage, and any other infrastructure components on behalf of its users. Where in Azure, it is Microsoft is the provider. IaaS providers also host users' applications and handle tasks including system maintenance, backup, or any other procedural activities, as well, which is offering a highly scalable resources. When it comes to pricing, we will have different models which we will have a look at some of the slides in future, which is based on the number of machines, number of virtual machines, or the VM size which we use it for. As part of the advantages of IaaS, the pay-as-you-go model, which will eliminate the capital expense of deploying hardware and software by user on-premise environments. And as well, it improves the business continuity. It helps for disaster recovery and the high availability of the applications. One of the benefits of moving IaaS is its lower infrastructure cost. That thereby it eliminates the capital expense and reducing an ongoing cost. As an enterprise, this will help an enterprise which can easily add capacity during a sudden business spikes. To add to the advantages, it will be highly scalable and a flexible solution, one of which can be addressed as one of the greatest benefits of IaaS. All this which is packed with a better security option with an appropriate service level agreement. Well, we understood what is Azure about and what is a Microsoft infrastructure as a service and how does Microsoft will host IaaS over Azure. So before we moving into our topics, what is SharePoint and hosting SharePoint in Azure, let us understand what is a virtual machine about. So we had an overview of Azure and IaaS. Now let us move on and understand how we set up SharePoint farm in Azure. A SharePoint farm, as we already know about what is a SharePoint farm consists of, it's all about virtual machines. A virtual machine for its application server, for its web server, for the database storage, or even for Active Directory services. So as we are familiar with the virtual machines, how different is a Azure virtual machine? Let us understand how an Azure virtual machine is different in in SharePoint context. In Azure, virtual machines are some programmable resources which can be added or removed very easily. We can add virtual machines on demand. For an example, we'll take an environment which is very minimal with a 2-server farm, and as and when our business needs, we can increase the availability, increase the capacity of virtual machines or its virtual machine hard disk from 2 to any hundreds or tens or hundreds of servers. There is no limit. As I said, these are the programmable resources from backend, and it is very scalable to improve it, to increase its availability. We can very easily scale up and down the servers. We can even start with a minimal resource of 1 core processor and a 4 GB of RAM, and it is very easily to move up to 32 core processors or with a high availability RAM. This configuration can be modified at any time during the deployment or even after hosting our application, which is a live application, which is in a live environment. And moving about pricing options, this definitely add value when hosting SharePoint in Azure. In Azure, we pay only for the resource what we use for. As these are the programmable resources, it is possible to be automated or batch it and schedule it as per the requirement. With Azure, Microsoft provides a 99.95% of availability with a better service level agreement registered. All right, we discussed about virtual machine. Now, we have Azure Storage behind the virtual machines. So what is an Azure Storage? Azure Storage is a cloud storage solution for modern applications that rely on durability, availability, and its scalability. This makes developers to build large-scale applications in Azure. So what are the what are the services offered by Azure Storage? Azure Storage also provides a different storage foundation for the virtual machines. In fact, when it comes to Azure Storage, we have 2 different variants. One is the standard storage and as a premium storage. So when we speak about the services offered from standard storage, we have 4 variants, which is like a blob storage. What we use it for is a unstructured object, which we store unstructured object data, which can be a document or a media file or any kind of files which is offered. And when it comes to a table storage, it will store the structured data sets. And in queue storage, we have the messages for workflow processing and any communication system. So as I have mentioned, the virtual machines are some of the programmable resources and which can be scheduled and processed. So queue storage will help us in processing a workflow. And we also have a file storage which fall under the standard storage. When it comes to premium storage, this completely holds all the virtual machine disks. So in virtual, this is what we are looking for in a SharePoint hosting in Azure. So for a SharePoint application to host, we will have to go for a premium storage option, which will hold all our virtual machine disks. So when, as I said, storage in the virtual storage in SharePoint, or we are aware for SharePoint, it is about virtual machines. So for this hosting SharePoint, we definitely go with a premium storage with virtual machine disk, and that will hold all the virtual machines for web server or app server or any databases. Here we have some few comparisons about Azure storage accounts. So in Azure Premium Storage, which will deliver a high performance and low latency disk support for the virtual machines, You can migrate your applications virtual machine disk for a speed and a better performance. When it comes to premium storage, as we host our SharePoint application, whether it be an intranet application or whether it's a public facing application, it will insist for a better performance and better scalability. Thereby we use a premium storage, and that will be used with a 5000 input output operations per second per disk. That's one of the feature which we will be looking for when hosting a SharePoint in Azure. So once we have it in with a premium storage, we have few more salient features about 35 terabyte per account per storage account. When comparing the same options with a standard storage, we will have a lesser operations of 500 IOPS per disk, and with a 1 terabyte per disk storage for a capacity. Well, now we got a understanding about what is a storage, what is a Azure about, how does Microsoft provides Azure, which is as an infrastructure as a service, and we understood what is a virtual machine and Azure storage, where does this belong to. So we will be moving into how we get a Azure subscription. So when it comes to Azure subscription and licensing, there is a provision like once we have a Microsoft Office 365 account for your organization, we will be making use of Office 365 account to log in into your Azure portal. So here we have a snapshot of Azure portal, which can be accessed with portal.azure.com. And once you log in with your organization account, it will have a dashboard, and it will have some of the resources which is available in the home page. We'll quickly navigate into the live session during a demo, and we will visualize how Azure portal looks like and what are the features which is available there. When it comes to Azure pricing, there are no upfront costs. So basically, if we start licensing, and if you would like to start processing in your Azure, your SharePoint environment into Azure, there are no upfront costs to be paid. It is only pay for only what you use it for. So based on your requirement, you can up and down the servers and the virtual machines or any resources which is provided in Azure that supports for SharePoint, and it recommends only payment which is required for what you are using it for. There is an example of example which I could highlight here. So if you for your organization you are building up an intranet application, and that will require different environments. For example, if there is a development environment, there is a staging, and there is a production environment. And once your development is completed, which is hosted with multiple servers, and you would like to test that with a load test. So based on your load test, you will create a staging environment with multiple servers or single server. And once the testing is completed, you can decommission the server, we can decommission the infrastructure, decommission the environment, hence thereby there is no other further payment for decommission it, and thereby you are paying only for what the resource which you have been used for. It also supports a permanent billing from the Azure licensing perspective. For an organization who is executing its operations on a weekly of 5 days of operations, and during a Saturday and Sunday, so there are a very minimal hours. So, and such an organization can opt for a permanent billing, which will definitely save your infrastructure costs in a high scale. When you go for a subscription options, there is a pay-as-you-go subscription, which will help you with no minimum commitments, and which is a subscription which is Azure is providing for a better scalability. Here we will have a look at what are the options to buy Azure. We have enterprise agreements option. So Azure can be added to your enterprise agreement with your organization. So using this, Microsoft will provide a 99.95% of SLA based on your service level agreement assigned with your organization. Another alternate ways is about selling buy through a Microsoft reseller. For a small or mid-sized organization, buy an open license program from a Microsoft reseller, and that will meet your business requirement. Finally, we can even get in touch with a Microsoft partner, explain about your business needs, and contact a Microsoft partner with business and technology expertise. So they will be able to recommend you a business solution, and that will meet your business needs. Azure is spread across, available globally at 32 regions in different locations. And once you host your environment, once you host your servers or any Azure resources, you can select the data center while configuring your virtual machine. And you can choose any of the available data centers listed here. Well, we got a understanding about what is Azure about, and let us move on and check like how we will manage. What are the tools which is supported in Azure, and how we manage this Azure for SharePoint. Azure has a management portal which we have seen in the previous slide, and as well we will look through a demo. We will access it using portal.azure.com. Using portal.azure.com, which will help in managing our resources in Azure, and which is used to build, manage, and monitor from your web applications, which is hosted in your cloud application. You can manage web apps, databases, virtual machines, any virtual networks, and any storage or permissions which is allocated from Azure Management Portal. You can provide a role-based access for your organization. When it comes to Azure Resource Manager API, so what are the resources? So it can be a resource can be of any component from Azure. It can be a SQL Server database, or it can be any of your virtual machine, or it can be any of your business applications. And a bundle of these resources become a resource group. Using a Azure Resource Manager API, we can programmatically control these resources and manage the permissions, or manage the resources to make it add or remove the resources, or remove the virtual machines, or increase its data capacity, or any of the capacity. It can be of a processor. Any of these operations can be managed using an Azure Resource Manager API. When it comes to development perspective, as a developer, everybody will be familiar with Visual Studio. So Visual Studio is one of the commonly used application model or development and IDE, which is used for developing the applications and hosting into Azure. So once in Visual Studio, we will be able to develop your application and host directly into the Azure, which is the SharePoint, which is hosted in Azure. And when it comes to management of the servers, PowerShell is quite well used for scripting, and all the SharePoint command lines, of course, will be supported using PowerShell. And Azure command line interface is used to create, manage, and delete the services on the command line, and using a command line interface or a PowerShell script. Well, we'll quickly walk through a demo on Azure Management Portal. I will open up with a solution with the browser. I'll access portal.azure.com. Okay, so this is going to be login. It will ask for an authentication. So I'll log in to the site using my Office 365 account. Okay, let me log in again. Okay, so this is well, we have logged in. So this is our Azure portal, and we have our dashboard which shows the service health, which will list all the which will list with a map, and that will locate the availability of different services in different regions, and it will also list what are the resources which we are subscribed for, and we can even add more resources. And these are the different tiles which we have pinned to the dashboard and which can be easily accessed. So let us see what are the resources which is available. So as an Azure resource portal, we have the resource groups, and there are different options to add the resources. So it can be a virtual machine or SQL database, or we can validate the subscription, we can view the billing information, and many. Okay, once I click on new, we have a marketplace. That's where we add the resources to host SharePoint in Azure. So once we come to add new resource, okay, we are in marketplace, and once I click on compute, we will get a different server environments. So we have Windows Server, or we have Linux Server. There are many other resources. And when we move on, we have networking resources, and intelligence analytics, which some of the other supporting resources which can be used for SharePoint, or which can be hosted in which are hosted in Azure. So today's topic, we are mostly concentrated on SharePoint. So let me search for SharePoint here. Yep, this lists all the SharePoint resources. Yes, we have a SharePoint Server 2016. We have SharePoint 2013 with HA Farm, and we have two more. Okay, well, we'll come back and build a SharePoint farm from this environment. Before we build that farm, let us go back to our presentation and understand a little bit of why we need to host SharePoint in Azure and how we are doing that. Okay. So next we will be moving deploy SharePoint in Azure. So before that, let us understand what are the different hosting models for SharePoint. So firstly, let us we are mostly familiar about the on-premise environment. So for on-premise environment, which we man completely from the applications, whether it is a database or all middleware services or virtualizations, servers, storage, networking, completely managed by your organization. Excuse me. I'm sorry. So we'll manage all enterprises, all the resources will be completely managed by the organizations when it comes to on-premises. So that's how we manage our SharePoint environment a years back. That's where when we host our SharePoint in March 2007 or SharePoint 2010 or SharePoint 2013. But when it comes to towards the right, we have mentioned about software as a service, which is completely managed by Microsoft. So that is nothing but we host your SharePoint in cloud, that is the SharePoint Online from Office 365. How does it differ is in SharePoint Online, we do not have any control. It's completely managed by Microsoft, whether it is an application, whether it is database or any middleware, servers, all storage, all informations are completely managed by Microsoft using Office 365 account, and we will pay for the license for the Office 365 account. How about there is there is an infrastructure which is a mix of on-premise and which is managed by Microsoft. So that's what we have, infrastructure as a service, and that's what we are covering today about hosting SharePoint in Azure. This scenario, we have some of the components which is managed by Microsoft. It can be those are the servers, the storage, its networking, and the virtualizations are completely managed by Microsoft. When it comes to the components which is managed by organization, that's where we would like to have more control. What are the applications to be hosted? What is the data to be stored? And on what are any other middleware applications we would like to interact with? So that's when infrastructure as a service will help to implement an application for the organization. So in infrastructure as a service, we use the infrastructure from Microsoft, that's a cloud service, and host our application that is SharePoint, host a SharePoint in Azure. When we plan for deployment of a SharePoint in Azure, we have to cover about the connectivity and how we manage its authorization, and we would also have look at some of the migration options. Now, before we make some SharePoint deployment in Azure, we will quickly check some of the steps in VPN connections. So, why we need a VPN connectivity? So, as and when we have registered with Azure, and when we make a virtual machine, we will be able to download the remote desktop instance, and we can connect to the remote desktop and directly access the machine and access or start using SharePoint, host your SharePoint and start using. But when do we need a VPN connection? So VPN connection is basically required when you have a SharePoint in Azure and there are some data which resides in your on-premise data center. And how do we make this connection between on-premise and SharePoint and Azure? So that's what we make. We complete that using VPN options. That these are the three different options available, which is express route, site-to-site VPN, and point-to-site VPN. Express route have a high throughput and a bandwidth, which is definitely help for your applications to make it highly available. And this also support up to 10 gigabytes per second of speed on the network speed. When it comes to site-to-site VPN, it has a different configuration of encrypted traffic, and which is of a lesser speed. So based on your application, based on your infrastructure, based on your usage, you will be able to select your option of VPN connections. So it is basically decided by the number of devices to connect to Azure, and also based on the speed and reliability which you would recommend for your application. Well, now we have covered about the connectivity options, and let us understand what is based on what is on the identity. So how we will how does SharePoint will authenticate? How does SharePoint authenticate with the different virtual machines? So SharePoint server use Windows Server Active Directory for authentication. As we are aware, SharePoint is using Active Directory, and when it moves to SharePoint Online, there is no change. So here, in fact, it uses Azure Active Directory Domain Services. There are two major factors that will be considering the okay. So once it moved to identity, like you are on-premise SharePoint server, it is using Active Directory, and that there it will host all the users, service accounts, and any authentication will be filled from Active Directory. There is not much difference when we move to Azure. Azure uses Azure AD Domain Controller Services. This is as similar as any virtual machine, and which will establish a connectivity with an on-premise server. You can configure a brand new domain and get it synced from your on-premise Active Directory to host your application. SharePoint in Azure uses Azure Active Directory for client authentication over Internet. Hence, we could conclude in a way like a SharePoint is using Active Directory. Instead Windows Active Directory, it is using a Active Directory domain services from Azure. So once you have a Active Directory set up in on-premise, it can be mapped and synced to the Azure AD services, and once the SharePoint is hosted in Azure, it is going to authenticate using the same credentials which is used in your Active Directory, and that will be coming from Azure AD services. All right, now that we have built our foundation for moving SharePoint into Azure, now we decided on connectivity and established a connection. We discussed about identity and what are the authentication procedures. Let us check what are the migration options when moving into Azure from SharePoint. So as we have when we have a SharePoint in on-premise, and we plan to move your on-premise SharePoint into Azure. So how we will move this information into Azure? That's what we will compare during this migration phase. So there is you can migrate the option using you will have a SQL on-premise which you have in your SharePoint, which you have a SharePoint in on-premise, and the same SQL we are going to replicate into Azure. So deploy another SQL server in Azure service, which is your database server, and replicate the content onto cloud. After you replicate the content, deploy or install and configure all your VMs with SharePoint configurations, and also make the failover and deploy failover and the configuration steps for your SharePoint. By the way, you will be moving all the content in from SharePoint in on-premise to SharePoint to the VM or to the database in Azure. And alternatively, you can do a backup operation using a backup and restore the database into Azure using the Storage Explorer. There is also an automated approach for migrating the content, which is using Azure Site Recovery. Azure Site Recovery is a service which is provided for a failover recovery by Azure, and in fact that is used to clone the servers. So when it comes in manual approach, we are moving the content as a content DB. As we are aware, SharePoint is completely stored in different content DBs. All your web applications or all your sites, all configurations, everything which we have in content DB is moved into Azure by a backup and restore of content DB operation. But when it comes to an automated approach, what happens is you will, using the Azure Site Recovery service, you will be able to map and clone the server from on-premise into your Azure. That way you will get you will get all the operations, all the installations, everything which is configured in your on-premise server can be moved to Azure. In fact, there is a limitation about moving this content. There is a disk size limitation of 1 terabyte, which is supported using Azure Site Recovery service. If your content is very huge, then it will be you may move back to the manual approach by moving the content database. But in fact, if there are some certain enterprise organizations which who are having a very large terabytes of data, then how do we move that data? So replicating over this large data over internet is not a best idea to do. So copying over this data over internet will be a slow, and that will impact your turnaround time. So what the alternate option is, make your content into, put that into a disk and ship that to Azure Datacenter, and Azure Storage import or export services will be used here to make will be used. That is a service which will help to move the large data center, and then Azure Data Team will export your data with a secured key into the server which is allocated, and from there you will be able to manage your content and publish your services. Okay, so that's about how we manage Azure and how we manage the content and authentication. Now let us move and check how we will deploy SharePoint into Azure. So we will be creating we'll create and configure some virtual machines and deploy the SharePoint into the resource manager, and we will also look at some of how do we customize some form templates. Okay, when it comes to SharePoint in Azure, we have basically there are 4 models available, and these are the 4 configurations which we can buy as a part of a SharePoint package in Azure. There are 2 different trial versions. One is of SharePoint 2013 and a SharePoint 2016. These are the standalone image with a complete installation of a SharePoint environment, and with some of the components which will require some additional configurations, or you would need to run your configuration wizard that will make the configurations for SharePoint. It also has from SharePoint 2013 context, it also have 2 other farms, that is HA Farm and Non HA Farm. For a high availability farm, you have a 2 or 3 tier SharePoint farm in Azure, which includes Azure Domain Services and SQL Server, and that will include of 9 servers with 29 core processors. When comparing to that with a Non HA Farm, that will host a similar environment with lesser servers and 10 core processors. So based on your enterprise organization, or based on your organization level, it's better to choose the HA Farm or the Non HA Farm based on your business needs. Well, we will have a look at HA Farm SharePoint farm topology here. So when it comes to SharePoint, as we are aware, it has been spread across into multiple servers, and how we will share that load between different servers. So as a web application on the web front-end server, we have 2 virtual machines which is hosted with a 4-core processor and a 14 GB RAM. And this is supported by a load balancer. So any request, any user request which will be addressed by a load balancer, and that will process your request into the available web front-end servers, and that will make your response, that will make the user's response very fast. And on the backend, on the application side, on the app server, there are additional 2 more virtual machines with similar configurations. And moving to the backend where the data is stored, which we have in context of SharePoint, all your web applications, all your sites, everything is being stored in content database, and that is nothing but different virtual machines hosted, and it will be hosted with 3 virtual machines with a SQL always on option, with a better configuration of servers, and that will help in processing the database operations very faster. And as we have covered about the Active Directory services, when it comes to SharePoint and Azure, SharePoint in HA Farm, that will provide with 2 virtual machines which has a 2-core processor, and that will host all the Azure Active Directory related services, and this completely make up as a HA Farm. When we move to non HA Farm, it is a little easier configuration, and which is a smaller farm, and that will have a load balancer which is supported with a web and app server which is configured in a single virtual machine. And moving to the database front, we have a SQL server that will host the content database or all the database operations, and is supported by a virtual machine for Active Directory services. Okay, now we can move on to a demo of how does a SharePoint Farm template looks like in Azure. Okay, coming back to Azure portal, yes, we have seen the resources available here. Now let us quickly build a SharePoint farm. So I'll search for a SharePoint server, SharePoint instance. Okay, I got SharePoint server 2013, 2016, and a few more SharePoint instances we have seen earlier. Now we are going to build a SharePoint server 2016, which is okay. For now we have a trial version. So this, once I select that, it and give the basic information about this, will create a virtual machine which is a trial image, and this image includes a complete installation of SharePoint 2016, and you can set up an Active Directory or a SQL server along with this in the SharePoint farm. So from this information, we will accept with the license, and yeah, here we will select a deployment model. So here in this case, we will select a resource manager, and we'll say like create this farm. So as we have come across what is a resource manager and how does it work. So there are a bundle of resources which is grouped into a resource group, and that's where we are going to build the SharePoint farm in a resource group. Hence it will be easy to manage the operations, and it will be easy to manage the settings and the permissions based on the resource group. So on basic configuration settings, okay, we have to enter a name. Okay, I'll place it like a webinar as the name. Okay, I'll place it webinar, and this type like it is SSD, and this I will prompt for a user. So here I will make it like for this example, I'll make it with a demo user. Well, I'll need to enter a password for this instance. Okay, I have a password, and here for this subscription, for this login, I'm using a pay-as-you-go subscription, which is highly beneficial on the license costing. And here we are going to create a resource group. So here let me use this as a Trigent resource group. Okay, and here this we have the list of locations which is available here, and these are we can view all these locations here, and it will be easy to select one of the location from this, and I choose the East US. I say okay. So with this basic configuration, it's going to select me a virtual machine size. That will be a standard size, or with a 4-core processor and 28 GB. So I select this option. Okay, I'll select, and with all the default options, I'm moving on with all the high availability and all the default settings. I submit this. So on running the final validation, it is going to validate all the entries which are placed here, and I say okay. This is going to submit the deployment, and it's going to runtime. It is going to configure and deploy your SharePoint 2016 environment. So as and when this complete, it will take some instances, some few more minutes to complete. So that will but on completion of this, it's going to make a SharePoint farm completely ready for a SharePoint 2016, which is ready to use. this is a SharePoint 2016, but instead if we move on with a SharePoint 2013 HA Farm, that will make a completely available SharePoint farm. So what we have seen is a different farm template. So where does this farm templates come from? We can quickly look at how do we customize a farm template by logging to github.com Azure. So here let us search for a quick start guide. Okay, I'll search for quick start guide. Yeah, here we have some quick start templates, and from here let me search for a SharePoint farm. Yes, we have here, and in this, yeah, here we have a JSON file. So this JSON file is built using this JSON file. We have Microsoft is building the complete farm, and this is a quite big JSON file, and it will be completely mapped with the SharePoint settings and the mapping and the number of servers. The server configurations is completely filled with this JSON file, and as a developer, you'll be able to edit this JSON file and update your configuration. Well, so we'll be let us check how the server is. Yeah, here it is still moving ahead with the deployment. So once deployment is completed, we will move on to the presentation meanwhile. Okay, so when it comes to the demo part, we are completed. Okay, so quickly we will look at some of the operationalizing in Azure. So when it comes to governance, what are the options which we have, and what are the governance policies which we have to consider? When it is in Azure, so who will have access to Azure? So that is one of the primary thing which you have to be handled with your organization, and it can be assigned with a role-based access control, and which will be managed by the resource group. So we have created our SharePoint farm in a particular resource group, which is for a Trigent group, and whenever we submit a portal, whenever you submit your SharePoint or any other resources in Azure to a particular resource group, that will be managed by, it can be assigned for roles, and it will be managed by the resource groups, and that's how we restrict the permissions in accessing the Azure portal or the content or the resources in Azure portal. Some of the other operations which Azure support is backup, and when it comes to backup, it will back up your virtual machines into Azure as a 3-copy, and anytime there is a backup and failover, Azure will automatically move into the service which is available, and it will enable their service. And it also supports a disaster recovery site, which will make your application highly available across your environment. Well, with that, we have come up with the understanding of Azure, how we host SharePoint in Azure.
All right, that was great, Trigent. Thank you so much for your time now. So let's look at the takeaways from today's webinar. We saw about we spoke about the infrastructure as a service and the advantages of it. We spoke on why Azure, and in Azure we showed you what is virtual machines, about the storages. We spoke about storage accounts, subscriptions, the licensing part, the options to buy. We spoke about the data centers, the tools, and we also spoke a few things on plans for Azure Connectivity, migration to Azure Virtual Machines, and we also spoke about the topology for SharePoint 2013 with HA and with Non HA farms. Lastly, thanks to Trigent, we experienced on how to deploy SharePoint on Azure. All right, I think we have a couple of more minutes. Now, I'd like to step back and request all the attendees to pose your questions now. Please pose your queries. Use the tool in the control panel marked questions to do so. We just wait for a minute for a couple of questions. And then, okay, I think we have a question here already. Trigent, we have a question which is like this. How does SharePoint in Office 365 different from SharePoint in Azure? They're asking what is the recommended solution?
Okay. Yep. As we have covered, what are the services provided by Azure? So in a single statement, I could say like a software which is a SharePoint in Office 365 is a software as a service, and when we move to SharePoint, hosting SharePoint in Azure, that's nothing but infrastructure as a service. So how does it differ is, if you have a SharePoint in online, that is completely controlled by Microsoft, and which we cannot do any custom developments or custom deployments. But when it comes to your Azure, so you get a completely as a on-premise environment, you will get a complete server, you will get your database, you can completely host your any applications, and you can build and deploy any of your custom solutions. So that's the advantage of using SharePoint in Azure. And what based on your solution, which is the recommended solution? I would say like it would depends on your requirements. It depends on your business needs. And if you have a very security system, some of the external applications which your SharePoint has to connect with, then that will be a recommended solution will be in Azure. But for a simple solution, and if it is completely managed by Microsoft, then it will be a SharePoint Online.
All right, thank you for that. I see a second question here. So the second question being, can I select multiple data center locations for hosting my servers?
Okay, that's quite possible. I would quote with an example here. For example, for your organization which is located in multiple locations of your of the world, and in the region, if it is globally located, you can choose your data center to be built from different locations. Thereby, you will have your applications available, and thereby it will have a better network and bandwidth by accessing the content from the very nearby locations.
All right, thank you, Trigent. Yes, I see a few more questions on the question box here, but unfortunately, due to the time constraint, we wouldn't be able to answer those questions here. But we will definitely get in touch with all of you guys to answer these questions. Right. So, lastly, I'd like to thank you all for taking time, and hope this session was an eye-opener and you got to learn something from this. So we look forward for your continued support and hope to see you all very soon in our next webinar. Meanwhile, do feel free to reach out to us with any of your questions. Also, do share your thoughts and suggestions and topics that you wish to gain further insights into. Thank you again, and have a